Nazism and Zionism, we often hear about them like they're total opposites.
Right.
But what if I told you there are some like surprising parallels in where they came from, like how they started?
Mm.
So today we're going deep on some academic excerpts that really make you kind of rethink these two movements.
Oh,
You
sure.
ready to maybe have some assumptions challenged?
Sure.
Okay, good. So we're going to kind of unpack the core ideologies of both Nazism and Zionism, and then look at how those ideas actually played out, in history.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the most like thought-provoking claims from this material is that both movements share roots in nationalism and ideas of like racial purity.
Yeah, that's a claim that always gets people talking for
Yeah.
sure. So to like really get it, we have to step back to 19th century Europe.
Right.
So back then, nationalism was like super on the rise.
Yeah.
And this idea of a nation got really tied up with shared ancestry, like bloodlines.
Okay. So how did this like play out in the development of both Nazism and Zionism?
Well, both movements, although in different ways, wanted to establish a homeland, for their people,
Right.
based on a sense of, racial superiority
Mm.
and historical claims to a certain territory.
Mm.
So the Nazis,
Mm.
obviously, they had their idea of Aryan supremacy and their whole vision of a greater Germany.
Right.
And on the other side, you have the Zionists. Their goal was to create a Jewish state in Palestine.
It's so interesting how both movements kind of like tapped into this idea of a nation defined by, blood
Yeah.
and like where you belong. But how did that actually translate into, real policies?
And actions.
Right.
Okay, so for the Nazis, this idea of racial purity led to like horrific persecution and ultimately genocide of Jews, Roma, and other groups that they thought were racially inferior.
Right.
And their whole vision of a greater Germany meant like expanding their territory, often at the expense of their neighbors.
And for the Zionists, how did this idea of a Jewish homeland like actually play out?
Well, the Zionist movement had to figure out how to create a Jewish state in a place where a lot of Arabs already lived.
Right.
So that led to some complex and often difficult interactions between the two groups, something we'll get more into later.
Okay. Now here's something that might surprise some people. Did you know that Nazi Germany and Zionist leaders actually cooperated for a bit in the 1930s?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about that part of history.
Right.
So in 1933, they signed this thing called the Havara Agreement. It was basically a deal that made it easier for German Jews to move to Palestine.
Whoa, okay. So the Nazis helping Jews leave. That seems a little counterintuitive, to say the least. What was going on there?
It does seem strange at first.
Right.
But to get it, you got to think about what both sides wanted.
Okay.
So for Hitler and the Nazis, this agreement helped them get Jews out of Germany, which is what they wanted.
Right.
And for the Zionists, it gave them a chance to grow the Jewish population in Palestine, which helped them get closer to their goal of a Jewish state.
So they both kind of saw it as a win, even though they had such different, ideologies and obviously like very different long-term goals.
Exactly. It's a good example of how groups that seem totally opposed can actually find common ground, at least for a little while, even if it's, more about practical stuff than shared values.
Right. And get this, the sources even have quotes from top Nazis saying they support Zionism and Jewish immigration to Palestine. It's just wild to see that kind of convergence, even if it didn't last long.
Yeah, it really challenges this simple idea that these movements were like completely opposed in every way.
Right.
What it shows is a much more nuanced and complex reality.
Okay, so we're seeing some interesting parallels already, but this next idea from the sources really adds another layer to the discussion. It's this term nationalist socialism
Right.
to describe a blend of socialist and nationalist ideas that were in both movements.
Yeah, nationalist socialism can sound kind of contradictory. I mean, traditional socialism is often about like internationalism.
Yeah.
And working class solidarity across borders.
Right.
But both Nazism and Zionism, despite their differences, they embraced a kind of socialism that put their own nation's needs first, above like broader class interests.
So how did this nationalist socialism actually look in each movement?
Well, because the Nazis, it meant getting the German people behind this idea of national unity and strength,
Okay.
with the state basically running the economy and social life. They shut down independent labor unions and anyone who disagreed with them, all in the name of like achieving these national goals.
And what about the Zionists? How did this idea of nationalist socialism shape their approach?
Well, one of our sources talks about David Ben-Gurion. He was a major Zionist leader, and he believed that Jewish labor and capital should mainly go toward building a Jewish state.
Interesting.
and achieving national self-sufficiency.
It's fascinating how both movements took socialist ideas and made them fit their own nationalist goals. Makes you think about how ideologies can be like molded, you know, and reinterpreted in all these unexpected ways.
For sure. It shows how adaptable ideologies are and how they can be used to serve different purposes, sometimes even like totally conflicting ones.
Now, let's talk about something a little more sensitive, but super important.
Okay.
How did both movements view the people who were already living in the territories they wanted to control? How did their ideologies deal with that? You know, the folks who were already there. That's a question that gets to the core of some, you know, tough and maybe even uncomfortable parts of history. What do our sources say about how Nazism and Zionism dealt with this issue?
Well, for the Nazis, the idea of Lebensraum was really important. It means living space. They thought the German people needed more territory to expand, to thrive. And they were willing to kick out or even kill other people to get it.
And that's what happened with the Polish population in World War II.
Right.
Yeah.
The Nazis systematically forced out and murdered millions of Poles so Germans could move in. They saw Poles and other Slavic people as inferior, you know, as obstacles to their vision of a racially pure Greater Germany.
It's scary to think about how those ideas actually played out with such brutality. Okay, but on the Zionist side, how did they view the Arab population that was already in Palestine?
Well, the Zionists had this goal of making a Jewish state.
Right.
But they had to figure out how to do that in a place where a lot of Arabs already lived. Their views on that issue changed over time and were different among the various Zionist groups. But some key figures like David Ben-Gurion, they worried about possible conflict.
Yeah.
And wanted to find ways to reduce Arab influence in the future Jewish state.
And our sources actually have some quotes from Ben-Gurion about this. He talked about limiting Arab labor and preventing what he called a hostile alien element. It's tough to hear that language, especially knowing what we know about the Nazi ideology.
Yeah, those words are definitely unsettling. And they raise important questions about how Zionist leaders dealt with this complicated situation.
Right.
Trying to make a Jewish state in a land that was already home to another people. It's a historical reality full of ethical and political issues that are still relevant today.
It shows that even movements with good goals and intentions can sometimes make tough choices, you know, and maybe use tactics that aren't so clear-cut morally.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to always look closely at the actions of historical movements and leaders, even the ones we tend to admire or agree with.
Right.
Because no movement or ideology is perfect. They all have to deal with the realities of politics.
Right.
And that often means making compromises.
Okay. This brings us to another interesting parallel that our sources talk about. It's the idea of a victim mythology and how it influenced both Nazism and Zionism. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. Both movements in different ways use stories of past suffering and victimization to build up their ideologies and to get their followers on board. You know? So for the Nazis, it was the humiliation of Germany losing World War I. And what they saw as unfair treatment in the Treaty of Versailles, they were really good at using these grievances to make people feel resentful, especially towards Jews, who they blamed for betraying Germany. So they made this story where Germany was the victim and Jews were the bad guys. Exactly. And that story was super powerful. It helped them get people's support, and it gave them an excuse for their aggressive actions. Now, on the Zionist side, the experience of centuries of anti-Semitism and, of course, the Holocaust, that became like a core part of their identity and their reason for wanting a homeland in Palestine.
Yeah, it makes sense that such intense suffering would shape how people see the world and their political goals.
Of course. But this idea of a victim mythology, even though it often comes from real pain and trauma, it can also be misused. You know, it can be used to silence critics, to justify doing bad things, even to make the other side seem less human.
So both movements kind of tapped into these powerful stories, but with very different results and different moral implications.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that the scale of suffering in each case was completely different. The Holocaust, a planned genocide carried out by the Nazis, is a unique horror in human history. Nothing else compares to it. It's crucial to understand that difference.
Right.
Even while also recognizing how both movements use these ideas of victimhood to shape their identities and justify their actions.
So this makes me wonder, do our sources address whether democracy really works when one side has so much control over the story?
That's a big question, and it goes way beyond just these two examples.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of how democratic societies deal with powerful narratives and propaganda.
Makes you think about who controls information. how stories get shaped, and who benefits from those stories. Super relevant today.
Right, absolutely. With social media and all the misinformation out there, being able to think critically about information,
Yeah.
to question the stories we're told,
Mm,
and to consider different viewpoints, that's maybe more important now than ever.
okay. Let's shift gears and talk about how both Nazism and Zionism used media and propaganda. The Nazis were obviously like masters of propaganda,
Right.
but our sources say the Zionist movement also had some pretty sophisticated strategies to shape public opinion and get support for their cause.
Yet both movements understood how important media and propaganda were. They knew they could influence how people saw things and affect political outcomes. So the Nazis, under Joseph Goebbels, they created this ruthlessly effective propaganda machine. It controlled all the media
Right.
and constantly pushed their ideology. They used radio, film, newspapers, rallies, all of it,
Right.
to spread their message of hate and to make their enemies look bad, especially the Jews.
And their propaganda worked. It was scary how effective it was at shaping opinion in Germany and even influencing how people saw things internationally. But how did the Zionist movement use media and propaganda?
Well, they didn't have the same kind of control over the media as the Nazis did in Germany. But Zionist groups did a lot to engage with journalists and filmmakers. They spread information about how Jews were suffering in Europe, and they showed the Zionist project as a just and necessary response to all the anti-Semitism. They also worked hard to build relationships with important people and governments to get political and financial backing for their goals.
So even though they were working in different situations and with different resources, both movements knew they had to control the narrative to shape how the public saw things.
Exactly. It shows the power of media and propaganda in shaping history and influencing people's opinions. It's a reminder that we should always be careful about what information we consume and question the stories we're being told, especially the ones that play on our emotions or reinforce what we already believe.
A lesson that's maybe more relevant today than ever.
For sure, with the constant flood of information we're all dealing with, trying to figure out what's true and what's not.
Right. Now, let's get back to the historical parallels we've been discussing. Our sources compare how Nazi Germany shut down political opposition to some of Israel's policies towards Palestinians.
Yeah, this is a very delicate and complex issue.
Yeah.
But it's important to talk about these parallels in a careful and thoughtful way. So we all know the Nazis were brutal. They wiped out any kind of political dissent, imprisoned, tortured, and murdered anyone who opposed them. They created an atmosphere of fear that made it impossible to challenge their authority. Now Israel, it's a democratic state, it has a lively political scene.
Yeah.
But its policies towards Palestinians, especially in the occupied territories, have been criticized a lot.
Right.
Human rights groups and international organizations say Israel restricts civil liberties and limits free speech.
Our sources mention things like discriminatory laws, restrictions on land ownership, and using the military to stop protests as evidence of these parallels.
Yeah, and those are serious concerns. It's important to consider the history and the security issues that have shaped Israeli policy. But we also have to acknowledge how those policies affect the lives of Palestinians and be open to an honest conversation about how to achieve a just and lasting peace in that region.
This conversation reminds me of something important that our sources emphasize. We need to be careful about making false comparisons,
Yeah.
It's good to look at historical parallels and see patterns, but it's equally important to recognize the fundamental differences between Nazism and Zionism.
Absolutely. To say these two movements are the same would be a huge oversimplification and a major injustice to the victims of Nazi crimes. The Holocaust was a singular event, a horrific act of genocide based on racial hatred and a desire to exterminate an entire people. There's nothing like that in the Zionist movement.
So while we can and should see the shared roots and sometimes troubling similarities between these movements, it's crucial to do so with nuanced sensitivity and a clear understanding of their different historical contexts and moral implications.
Right. The point of looking at these parallels isn't to condemn or excuse either movement. It's to understand history better and to see how powerful ideologies can be, how they can shape people's actions, for good or for bad.
It reminds us that history isn't simple. It's messy. And to truly learn from it, we need to understand all the shades of gray. It reminds us that we always need to be willing to, question what we think we know, to challenge those simple stories, and really grapple with how complicated history is. So after going so deep on these unexpected parallels between Nazism and Zionism, what are some of the main things you hope our listeners will take away?
I think the most important thing is to realize that Even ideologies that seem totally different can actually come from similar places
Yeah.
and use similar tactics to get what they want. And by understanding those patterns, we can get better at spotting and dealing with those kinds of ideologies today.
It's like we have this sharper lens to see the warning signs, and understand how people can twist stories for their own political gain.
Exactly. Whether it's extreme nationalism or ideas about racial purity or manipulating stories of victimhood, these are all dangerous things that keep popping up throughout history, and they often lead to terrible outcomes. So by studying the past, we can learn to recognize these patterns and find ways to counter them.
So history is like a guidebook, not for repeating the past, but for, avoiding the same mistakes.
Exactly. And it's not just about recognizing the patterns, it's also about getting how complicated historical events were and why the people involved did what they did. We need to look beyond the simple stories and really engage with the nuances of the past if we want to truly learn from it.
And that's why these deep dives are so important. They help us unpack these big, complicated topics, challenge our own assumptions, and develop a more critical way of looking at history.
Absolutely. And I hope this deep dive has made our listeners curious, and encourage them to keep exploring these things. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and more connections to find.
And as we've seen, even the most uncomfortable or difficult parts of history can teach us important lessons for today. If we're willing to look at those complexities, we can come away with a deeper understanding of ourselves, our world, and all the forces that shape it. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into those surprising connections between Nazism and Zionism. We hope you've all had some things to think about, and maybe even feel inspired to do some more digging on your own. Remember, history may not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.